Couple. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've met folks where they heal in the sense, I'm thinking of a particular couple I worked with, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, where they really made an enormous amount of progress in understanding what had happened. And it was the man had cheated with someone, had an affair with someone, and the woman was really hurt by this. And they made amazing progress toward mutual understanding. They could see, that's what was going wrong here. But the woman, for all of her understanding, she simply couldn't wrap her brain around being with someone who would have done that to her. She said, I can't think of marriage that way. I can't stay with someone who cheated, even though I can forgive him. I can understand, well, I see where he was coming from. I wish he hadn't done it. It was wrong. But I sort of understand it, but I still can't live with it. And I've met folks where that's the case, and I, of course, respect that.
Got it. Dr. Bruce, we covered very briefly earlier on about sex. So we mentioned sex very, very briefly. So one of the categories that I would like to talk with you is like sex. You mentioned there's good sex, and there's sacred sex.
Yes,
So
indeed.
I think it's very universally acceptable that healthy sex life means health marriage. But what more there is to it? Because you mentioned like there's those different types of sex.
Yeah. I define those 3 different levels, and they are kind of cumulative.
Okay.
And I write about this actually. I'll hold up a prop of my first therapy book, or book on couples, Reigniting the Spark: Why Stable Relationships Lose Intimacy and How to Get It Back. There's a shameless plug there. And one of the chapters, that particular one is one of the chapters from that book, Sex, Good Sex, and Sacred Sex. So when I say sex, I mean what I call plain old sex. What is that? Anything you think it is. That's what that is. Anything you put in the general category of sexual activity, that's plain old sex. And, what do you need to have plain old sex? First of all, in talking about what plain old sex is, there are people who were sexually traumatized, had been sexually abused or raped, or, have horrible experiences where even plain old sex is difficult or impossible. And to heal from that requires that you process the trauma. And that often requires therapy or, experiences that let you be able to process the trauma so it no longer triggers you, so that you can actually be okay with your own body and your own sexuality and possibly be okay with someone else. So that's, plain old sex is whatever you want to call sex. You need some basic knowledge. What is that? How do you do what, and what goes where, and who does what, and and not just knowledge about what goes where, which is what they tend, at least in the schools that my kids went to in the United States. When they have sex education, it's all focused on, put tab A into slot B, what goes where. They don't talk a lot about the feelings associated with it. They certainly don't talk a lot about pleasure. That's a different thing. But, the basic knowledge is what you need in order to have something of a sex life, if it involves even yourself, but certainly someone else as well. So that's all in the plain old sex category. So what do I mean by good sex? Now, there's a lot of different ways people could explain what I mean by good sex. What I mean by good sex is when it's not merely that you're having sex, it's that you are having sex intimately. Now, what do I mean by intimately? I mean, you are present and honest with yourself and each other. In other words, you show up emotionally and physically and spiritually, however you want to call it. You show up together and you're in that moment. That's what I mean by what most people would call that good sex. Not only does it feel good, because plain old sex can feel good too, but it feels good and enhances intimacy. It's an expression of intimacy between the couple. And, it's funny. Sometimes people will say, oh, you mean making love instead of just fucking. And actually, I don't just mean that, because sometimes people can have a resounding fuck that also is intimate. You wouldn't rule that out. You don't have to be politically correct for it to be what I would call good sex. And it's interesting because, power exchange stuff is often plays into what a lot of people define as good sex, the dominant submission type stuff. Again, different strokes for different folks, but that kind of thing can involve a lot of, power difference and things like that they play with. And that can be, for some folks, really good sex. So that can be very intimate if that's what they really want to express as their fantasy. So that's what I mean by good sex. It's basically plain old sex where you're actually intimately present with each other. That's what I mean by good sex. Now, what do I mean by sacred sex? Well, sacred sex is another step up. And of course, so really the question is, what do I mean by sacred? Sacred, the term, the Latin term, and it's actually related to the Hebrew word. It's not the same word, but they have similar meanings. The words for holiness in both of those languages mean set apart. Sacredness is when it's not merely about the two of you anymore. Now, folks in the Tantra tradition would talk about, getting in touch with forces that are much bigger and more universal. People in Western religions will talk about being in touch with God through their sex. There's all kinds of different ways of understanding it, but there's something about sacred sex that partakes of the sacred. And of course, lots of things can be sacred that aren't sex. People can do anything in a way that is, in a sense, that is involved with forces just greater than them. It's transcending just themselves. But sex is especially amenable to that because it's so powerful.
But then you're having a threesome. I mean, that's kind of weird. You're involving God into sex. I understand the sacred part. Like, it's something that you cherish and you look forward to, and it's something very special. I mean, I have a sacred moment every morning when I drink my coffee. But I don't feel like I'm involving any God into the mix, anything spiritual. And I think like involving things like this into sex, it's kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. If you personify it too much, and the idea of a threesome is not as a turnoff for a lot of people. Yeah, that wouldn't be my number one either. But the idea of participating, that you're not merely having sex, you're creating the universe as you do it. That's more of I think a Tantra inspired sort of idea, the idea that you're participating in forces that that are much bigger than all of us. That sense of joining with something much greater, that is a different level of experience than just feeling good. And I'm not knocking feeling good, by the way. Feeling good's great, But, and I want to say, when you're saying you're identifying you're sitting there with coffee as a sacred moment, there is something there. Again, you don't have to talk about an anthropomorphic sort of God, but that is a moment where you are somehow intimate with nature, or intimate with yourself, or intimate with the world. It's a moment. You called it sacred, I think, for a reason. Do you know what I mean? You didn't just say that's a nice moment. You have all kinds of nice moments. No, it's like you set that moment aside and you say, you know what, I'm going to have this as my morning ritual, and I'm going to be really present for it. To me, that's a sense of intimacy, and that's, that is partaking of the sacred in some ways.
Well, Dr. Bruce, that's perfect. That's beautiful. Thank you so much. I don't know what else to ask. This is beautiful. So where people can find you, where people can find your work?
Yes, indeed. Well, let me especially put in a plug for my most recent book.
Please.
This one, Betrayal and Forgiveness: How to Navigate the Turmoil and Learn to Trust Again. It's available anywhere books are sold. You can get it on Amazon, pretty much any place. You can get it in any of three formats. I have a paperback version, the one I was holding, also available for e-readers, either Kindle on the Amazon site, or you can get it for other e-readers at other places. And also the audiobook, which I did the narration of. So I'm especially promoting that. You can get information about any of my stuff, including my books, at my website, which is brucechalmer.com. So just brucechalmer.com does it. And you can get information about the podcast that I do with my wife, Judy Alexander. And the podcast title is Couples Therapy in 7 Words. So what we got for our website, you can actually type that all out, couplestherapyin7words.com. But there's a quicker way, CT in the number 7, CT